At 7:28, the door flew open and snow blew into the cafe. I was sitting in a corner booth with 2 cups of coffee going cold, already rehearsing my excuse to Rachel. A woman rushed in with snow on her wool coat, breathless and flushed. She spotted me, slid into the booth, and looked at me like she was checking for damage. I didn't know it yet, but the quiet life I'd built was about to crack open. I'm Owen. I'm 29 years old, and I build custom furniture in a workshop behind my house on the edge of a small town outside Spokane. It's not a big operation, just me, a table saw that hums too loud, a workbench covered in sawdust, and a stack of orders I usually finish 2 days late. I live alone above the workshop, where the stairs creak, the heater rattles, and the walls are thin enough that I can hear the wind move through the pine trees at night. That used to bother me, but now it's just another sound. The scar runs across my left palm, from the base of my thumb to the middle finger, a pale line that a table saw left 2 winters ago while I was ripping a maple board for a kitchen island, and the push stick slipped, and the blade went through the glove and the skin underneath before I knew what happened. The doctor said I was lucky I didn't lose the hand, but Sarah said the scar made her stomach turn every time she saw it. She was my fiancée, and we were supposed to get married the following spring, but she left 3 months after the accident because the silence in me had gotten too loud, and she couldn't sleep next to it anymore. I didn't argue. I just packed her boxes and carried them to her car in the rain, and I haven't heard from her since, because I haven't tried to. I don't go into town much anymore, and the grocery store, the hardware supply, and the gas station are the only stops I make. People see the scar before they see me, and women look at my hand before they look away, while men ask what happened, and I tell them the saw caught me, and they nod like that explains everything. It doesn't explain anything, because the scar isn't the reason I'm alone. The scar is just the thing people point to when they want an excuse to leave. My sister Rachel is the only person who still calls me on weeknights, and she's 34, married to a man who sells insurance, with 2 kids who scream louder than my saw. She thinks I need someone to talk to besides the wood, and for a year she's been trying to set me up, but I always said no. Then, last Tuesday, the workshop was colder than usual, and the pine trees were making a sound I didn't like, so I told her one date with no promises. She said the woman's name was Clara, and she taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary. Rachel said Clara was funny and stubborn and new to town, and she didn't know anything about me, which Rachel thought was an advantage. I didn't see how, but I said I'd meet her at the Copper Kettle at 6:30 on Friday. The Copper Kettle sits on a corner 2 blocks from the river, and it's small, with booths that are wooden and scarred. The owner is an old man named Gus, who wipes the counter with a rag that used to be white, and he doesn't talk much, which is why I like the place. I got there at 6:15 and ordered 2 coffees, because I didn't want to look like I was waiting when she arrived. The corner booth under the window was empty, and I sat there because the condensation collects on the glass and the street light outside turns the snow silver. By 6 o'clock, the snow had started falling heavy enough to muffle the traffic. Friday morning, I worked until 4, finishing the dovetails on a cherry cabinet, and my hands were stiff from the cold because the scar ached the way it always does before a storm. I sanded the joints until they fit without gaps, and then I swept the floor, locked the door, and drove to town with the heater blasting and the wipers fighting the snow. The roads were already slick. I passed 2 cars in the ditch without slowing down because I wasn't in a hurry. I just didn't want to be the kind of man who arrives late to his own disappointment. I wore the only clean shirt I had that didn't have sawdust in the collar, and it was blue, and Sarah used to say it made me look tired. But I didn't care because I wasn't trying to look like anything. Showing up was all I was trying to do. Rachel had sent me a text Thursday night with Clara's number and a photo, and Clara had brown hair pulled back, a green scarf, and a smile that looked like she was trying not to laugh at the camera. I stared at the picture for longer than I'd admit, And then I turned off the light and went to sleep, wondering if the morning would feel different than the ones before it. A couple sat 3 booths down, and they were holding hands across the table while the woman laughed at something the man whispered. I looked away. That kind of ease felt like a language I'd studied once and forgotten. I used to think Sarah and I looked like that from the outside, and maybe we did. But inside, I was already building the walls she finally walked through. The coffee machine behind the counter hissed every few minutes, and Gus made a cappuccino for someone I didn't see while the steam rose and vanished. I thought about the workshop, about the oak dresser I was sanding, and about how the grain ran straight and predictable, unlike people. Wood doesn't change its mind. It doesn't get scared and drive away, so it just sits there, waiting for you to figure out what shape it wants to take. I checked my watch at 6:45, and the minute hand seemed to stick while I counted the ceiling tiles. 12 across and 8 down made 96 total, and one of them was stained from a leak last spring. I stared at the stain until it started to look like a map of somewhere I'd never been, and I was starting to think nobody would come. After that, the door flew open. She pulled off her gloves and ran a hand through her hair, which was brown like in the picture, but wilder, and her cheeks were red from the cold, with a drop of melted snow on her eyelash, and she didn't brush it away. "Owen?" she said, and I nodded while she caught her breath, and the wind outside pushed another gust of snow against the door. "I'm so sorry. My car slid at the intersection by the library, and I sat there for 10 minutes, trying to decide whether to turn around or keep going, because I almost went home twice." Her voice was lower than I expected, not soft, but just calm, even though she was still catching her breath. "It's fine," I said, and I meant it, because the coffee was cold, but the night was suddenly warmer than it had been. She took off her coat and folded it onto the seat beside her, and she was wearing a green sweater that matched the scarf in Rachel's photo. When she looked at my face, she didn't look at my hands. She didn't look at the scar. Then she smiled, and it wasn't the polite smile people use when they're embarrassed, because it was real, and it reached her eyes. "You have kind eyes," she said. "I was worried you wouldn't." I didn't know what to do with my hands, so I looked down at the cold coffee and then back up at her, watching the drop of snow that had fallen from her eyelash shrink against the wood. Gus appeared without a word. He set down 2 fresh coffees before he took the cold cups and walked away, and neither of us thanked him because we were already somewhere else. I didn't know where somewhere else led, but I knew I didn't want to find the door back. We started with the safe things, and Clara told me she was 27 and taught 2nd grade at Lincoln Elementary, the old brick building 3 blocks from the river. She'd moved to town 6 months ago from Boise, and she still got lost trying to find the grocery store without her phone, so she lived in a small apartment above a bakery on Maple Street, where the smell of cinnamon rolls at 6 in the morning was the only alarm clock she needed. It sounded like a good way to wake up. I told her about the workshop, where the cherry cabinets, the oak dressers, and the maple cutting boards I sold at the farmer's market on Saturdays were the main part of my work. I told her how wood changes shape in the winter, shrinking and swelling with the humidity, and how you have to account for that when you fit a joint, or the whole thing cracks in March. She listened like she was trying to picture it, unlike most people who nod and change the subject. And then she asked what kind of saw I used for the dovetails. That surprised me. Then she looked at my hands, which were resting on the table scar side up because I hadn't thought to turn them over. "What happened?" she asked, not the way people usually ask, curious like it's a story they want to tell their friends, but direct, like she was asking about the weather. I told her the table saw caught me 2 winters ago when I was ripping a maple board and the push stick slipped and the blade went through the glove and the palm underneath, but the doctor said I was lucky. She didn't flinch, and she looked at the line across my palm like it was a map she was trying to read. "Does it hurt?" she asked. And I said it only hurt when it snowed or when I gripped something too long. She nodded, and she didn't say she was sorry, which I liked. Then she told me about her day, when a kid named Marcus had drawn a picture of her with wings during art class. He said she looked like a guardian angel because she stopped Braden Miller from eating paste, and she kept the picture in her purse and pulled it out to show me. The wings were purple and lopsided, and her head was too big for her body, but it was the best thing I'd seen in months. I almost laughed. I laughed, and the sound surprised me because it came out louder than I meant it to, and Gus looked over from the counter. I covered my mouth with my hand, but Clara was already laughing too, not at me, but with me, and it had been so long since I'd done that I almost didn't recognize the feeling. My breath caught, and I didn't know why, but she asked if I always laughed that loud, and I told her I didn't usually laugh at all. She said that was a shame, because my laugh sounded like something rusty being started after a long winter, and I didn't know what to say to that, so I took another bite of pie. We sat back, and the silence between us wasn't empty because it was full of the cafe's noises, the radiator knocking, the clock ticking, and the wind outside pushing snow against the glass. We watched the snow pile on the windowsill in soft, uneven layers, while the street lamp turned the drifts blue, and it felt like the world outside had slowed down just for us. I didn't mind the quiet. Gus walked over with a plate and set down a slice of apple pie with 2 forks without saying a word, and he just looked at us, then at the window, then walked away. Clara picked up a fork and said he thought we looked like we needed it, and I told her we did. The pie was warm. The crust was the kind that falls apart when you press it with a fork, and we ate slowly while I realized I was hungry because I hadn't eaten since breakfast. The sugar settled into my blood, and the booth felt softer, and the light from the street lamp looked less like a warning and more like a lamp. After the pie, Clara leaned back and turned her coffee cup in a slow circle on the saucer. I recognized the motion because I'd done the same thing with sugar packets an hour earlier. "Why did you really say yes to this?" she asked. And I thought about lying, because I thought about saying Rachel was persuasive, or that I was bored, or that it was just coffee. But Clara was looking at me with those eyes that saw the purple wings in a child's drawing, and I knew she'd see through it. So I told her the workshop was too cold and too empty, and the wood doesn't judge me, but it also doesn't talk back. I can sand a board for 3 hours, and nobody asks if I'm okay. And I like that. But last Tuesday, the pine trees made a sound I didn't like, and I thought maybe I'd forgotten what a voice sounds like when it's not my own. That was the truth. She went quiet and stopped turning the cup. And she said Rachel told her I was quiet, but she didn't say I was honest. I said Rachel doesn't know everything, and Clara smiled, but it was smaller this time and tighter. I noticed. "I almost didn't come," she said, "because my ex called last week and said I was too much for most people, too loud, too direct, and too stubborn, and he said I should learn to soften my edges if I wanted someone to stay." I looked at her, and her hands were still wrapped around the cup while her knuckles were white from the pressure. I could see it in the way her jaw set. "He was wrong," I said, and she went still while the cup stopped moving. She looked at me like I'd said something she hadn't expected to hear out loud, and her eyes got wet, but she didn't blink. I meant it. The pie was gone, and the light outside had turned from silver to blue, and I could feel the night shifting towards something I didn't have a name for. The cafe seemed smaller, and the snow outside had piled high enough to bury the streetlight. Clara turned her coffee cup in a slow circle, but this time she wasn't looking at it. And she was looking at the window, at the snow, at something past both of us. "There's something I haven't told you," she said. And I waited, because I'd learned that when people say that, the best thing you can do is keep your mouth shut. and let the weight land where it needs to. The radiator knocked. "I got a job offer in Chicago," she said. "A promotion, with more money, a bigger district, and an apartment with a view of the lake instead of a bakery ceiling. And I have to decide by Monday." The radiator knocked once behind me, and I felt the sound in my spine. My hands went cold, and the scar on my palm started to thump in time with my pulse. I was late tonight because I sat in my car for 20 minutes trying to decide whether to turn around or keep driving, and I almost went home because I kept thinking there was no point in starting something you can't finish. I looked at her, and the flush from the cold had faded from her cheeks, so she looked pale under the cafe lights, while the green of her sweater made her eyes darker. She looked tired, but not the kind of tired that sleep fixes. I asked her when she'd have to leave, and she said if she took the job, she'd need to be there in 2 weeks because the district was desperate and they were holding the position until Monday. 2 weeks wasn't enough time to finish a cabinet, let alone figure out if someone was worth staying for. That scared me more than the snow outside. The table between us was dark wood stained with 20 years of coffee rings that had seen more conversations than I ever would, and I wondered how many people had sat in this booth and made decisions that changed their lives, and whether any of them had looked as scared as she did. "Chicago is a long way from Spokane," I said, and my voice sounded flat even to me. "It's a long way from everywhere I've been," she said. "And that's the point. Because nobody there knows about the ex who called last week. And nobody knows I almost glued my hands together in front of a classroom. And nobody knows that I drive a 1998 Civic with a heater that only works on the passenger side. I could be anyone." I understood that too well, because after Sarah left, I thought about selling the house and moving to a town where nobody knew about the scar, or the saw, or the silence. And I thought about starting over in a place where I could be the man who smiles first. But I didn't, and I stayed and built thicker walls, and Rachel was right to call them a fortress, because you don't leave a fortress, you just reinforce it. That was safer. "I was engaged once," I said, and the words came out before I could stop them, because her name was Sarah, and we were supposed to get married in the spring, but then the saw caught me, and the scar happened, and the silence in me got louder, and she said she couldn't sleep next to it anymore. She left 3 months after the accident, and I packed her boxes and carried them to her car in the rain, and I haven't been on a date since, because I haven't wanted to. I built walls. I thought about the nights after Sarah left, about sitting in the workshop with the saw turned off, and the silence so complete that I could hear the house settle. I told Clara I'd thought about selling everything and moving to Boise or Portland or anywhere the walls didn't know my name. But I stayed because the workshop was paid for, and the house was familiar, and the pine trees didn't ask questions. Leaving felt like admitting Sarah was right, that the silence really was too loud, and that I was broken in a way no new town could fix. So I sanded boards and fitted joints and made furniture for other people's families. And I told myself that was enough. It was honest work that kept my hands busy, but it didn't keep the nights from being long. And it didn't stop the heater from rattling. And it didn't make the stairs any less lonely to climb. Clara didn't look away, and she didn't try to fill the space with sympathy words, but she just listened the way she had before. Like she was reading a map she didn't fully understand, but wanted to. "I'm sorry," she said, "because that kind of quiet doesn't go away. It just makes room." I felt them land somewhere below my ribs. I felt something shift in my chest. Not a crack, but just a shift, like a floorboard settling after years of holding still. And I told her Rachel calls my apartment a fortress, and she's not wrong. Building it kept people out because I thought if I made the walls thick enough, Nobody could see the mess inside. But I didn't realize I'd be the one trapped in it. I was alone. She asked me if I was angry at Sarah, and I said I wasn't because anger was just another noise, and I'd gotten good at tuning it out.
But Clara said anger wasn't noise, and she said it was a signal that something had mattered, and she said if I wasn't angry, it meant I'd stopped believing the marriage was real. I looked at my hands, and they were scarred, but they were still working, so I said maybe she was right. My throat tightened. Maybe the marriage had been real, and maybe I'd stopped believing it because believing it meant admitting I'd lost something I couldn't get back. She didn't say anything, and she just reached across the table and touched the scar with one finger. It only lasted a second before she pulled her hand back and wrapped it around her cup. Clara's eyes were wet now, but she wasn't crying because she was just present, and the presence felt heavier than tears. "Maybe Chicago was safer," she said, and her voice was barely above a whisper because there was no risk of losing something you just found, and if she leaves now, she doesn't have to watch it fall apart or wake up one morning and realize the silence got too loud again. My throat went dry. I looked at my scarred hand, and the line across the palm was white and raised, and it caught the light from the street lamp like a thread of silver. All the things I'd lost without trying to keep them ran through my head, like Sarah and the idea of being a husband, and the version of myself who laughed easily, and I'd let them go because holding on seemed harder than letting go. The weight of the night settled into my shoulders. "You can still lose something you never tried to keep," I said, and she looked at me while a tear fell onto her cheek and she didn't wipe it away, letting it sit there like the drop of snow on her eyelash earlier, like something she was offering as proof. "That's the problem," she said, "because I think I already have." The cafe had emptied while we were talking, and the couple from 3 booths down was gone, while the tables were cleared and Gus stacked chairs against the far wall, and the wind outside had picked up, and the snow was hitting the window in sharp, dry flakes, and the radiator had stopped knocking. The silence that followed wasn't the safe kind, because it was the kind that waits for someone to break it. I didn't move, and neither did she. We sat there, 2 people who had spent years building walls, suddenly wondering if the door between them was worth opening. Gus walked over and stood a few feet from the booth, and he didn't look at us because he looked at the window. It was time. "We're closing in 10 minutes, he said, and his voice was rough, like gravel in a bucket. I looked at Clara, and she was staring at her coffee cup like it might answer for her, because the cup was empty except for a thin ring of brown at the bottom, and she traced it with her finger. I didn't plan what I said next. "I don't know what happens in Chicago," I said, "and I don't know if the Lakeview is worth leaving the bakery ceiling, or if a bigger district makes you feel less lost. But I know what happens here if you leave, and it's nothing. And I'm tired of nothing." She smiled. My heart was beating harder than it had in years, not because I was scared of her answer, but because I'd finally asked a question I cared about. I watched her trace the ring of coffee on the saucer, round and round, like she was circling something she couldn't name. It was small, but it was real. "You're the first person who didn't try to talk me out of it," she said, "because everyone else says it's a great opportunity, and they say I'd be crazy to stay." She looked at me for a long time, and the street lamp outside shifted as the wind blew, and the light moved across her face like a slow searchlight. I didn't look away, because I wanted her to see that I meant what I said, and I wasn't trying to be romantic or brave. I was just tired of being the only person in my own life. "I'm not talking you out of it," I said, "because I'm asking you to stay for one more cup of coffee and maybe breakfast, and I make terrible pancakes, but I have real maple syrup from a farm down the road." She laughed. Telling her about my table at the farmer's market on Saturday came next.
And I said I could skip it if she wanted to see the workshop because it wasn't much, just sawdust and clamps and a window that leaked when it rained too hard.
She said she liked windows that leaked because they made you pay attention to the weather. I held on to that, not knowing I'd need it before the night was over. Smiling at her felt strange, like a muscle I'd forgotten to stretch, because I didn't know what to say. The sound filled the empty cafe, and Gus looked over from the counter where he was wiping the last table with his old white rag, and he didn't smile, but he didn't look away either. "You're terrible at this," she said. "I know," I said, "but my hands are steady, and I see the real you, past the wings and the teacher and the woman who drove through black ice." That was all I had. She put her hand over my scarred one, and her fingers were warm, and they fit into the spaces between mine like they'd been measured for it. "One more cup," she said, "and then we'll see." We got up, and I helped her with her coat, holding it while she slid her arms in, and the wool was damp from the snow and smelled like winter. She buttoned it slowly while I watched her hands move, and when she turned around, she looked up at me while the street lamp was behind her head and the snow was still falling, but softer now. I wanted to brush the snow off her hair. I paid for the coffees while Clara put on her gloves. Gus waved his hand when I reached for my wallet, but I left a 20 on the counter anyway. He didn't argue. He just looked at Clara, then at me, then nodded once, and that slow movement of his head was the most I'd ever seen him say in 3 years of coming to that cafe. The snow had piled up on the sidewalk in soft, rounded drifts, and the street was empty except for her Civic and my truck. The air smelled like cold metal and pine. She stood at the bottom of the steps, looking up at me, and the snow caught in her hair without melting. I wanted to brush it off, but I kept my hands in my pockets because I didn't want to startle her or myself. We stood there for a minute, not talking, just breathing. The snow fell between us, and the street lamp made it look like we were standing inside a lantern. She looked at my scarred hand, then back at my eyes. "You still have kind eyes," she said. And I didn't say anything because I just held the door open, and we walked out into the snow. The wind had died down. The snow kept falling, and the town didn't change. And the workshop was still cold while the stairs still creaked. But the quiet inside me shrank that night, and I didn't know if it would last. If you want to hear what Clara drew in her notebook the next morning, subscribe, because some stories don't end, they just start again. I hoped so.